Bonjour à toutes.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're really happy that you're here. Welcome to the Renault eWays, the new event dedicated to today's mobility and tomorrow's mobility, gathering together all those who work, practically speaking, so as to live up to the challenge, which is towards zero emissions. We're close to Paris at Hangar Y, which is a symbolic place. This is where the first electrified Zeppelin started in 1884. We've chosen this place or this venue on purpose. We have Virginie Bouteuil with us, who's a researcher at the École des Ponts and also Deputy Director at the Institute for Sustainable Mobility at Renault Paris Tech. How are you? I'm good, thanks. Right. Now, the Renault eWays program is here to look at all types of mobility, zero carbon or sustainable mobility. By the way, this is the name of your institute, Institute for Sustainable Mobility. So that we set the stage, can you tell us more about IMD's mission? Certainly. The IMD is a partnership type of platform between the Renault Group and engineering schools, some of the most famous ones in Paris. And it started in 2009, so more than 10 years. So Renault and these schools such as l'École des Mines, l'École des Ponts, l'École Polytechnique, l'École Télécom Paris are working together to work on disruptive programs for Renault, the industrial group, and this for emerging markets. So the IMD is all about this. We have Renault co-workers representing all sectors that work more and more with researchers in economy, sociology, geography, and also management sciences. They ask questions that otherwise people would not have thought of, and that is also to answer the questions, and to do this we use tools that nobody had thought of. It's a very nice initiative and story. Absolutely. To me, this is like the best brains working together. I suppose you're working on very thrilling projects. Could you give us examples of what you've been working on in the past 10 years? Well, what the IMD's worked on mainly is electric vehicles. The IMD started even before the first Zoe was launched, and we were lucky enough because we worked with Renault on electric vehicles from the word go. If I were to tell you more about this history or our track record, we've worked on how we could make sure that French households would get an electric vehicle depending on their needs. We've worked on the role of companies so that we have more electric vehicles in France, and also the levers to use, the obstacles to overcome, so that our channels would work well to sell our cars. And then we opened up 2 new markets. We worked with Renault on possible deployments of Quid EV in China. We've also worked on potential electric mobility in India. And recently, we've been working on a new program in the field of electric vehicles. That is, we're looking at a perspective for electric mobility in Africa. We wonder which segment will start first, but we'll try and cover all the segments, that is the two-wheelers, buses, coaches, LCVs and minibuses, plus cars, of course. And the question is for us is how we could put together value-added services which will be useful for electric mobility in Africa. That's very interesting. I see the sparkles in your eyes when you're talking about this, because I suppose that every single day there are innovations and new things that emerge. Now, the title for this interview is New Needs, Better Mobilities. Since you're working on many projects, maybe we could start looking at a general overview. Can you tell us what the main trends are, the global trends, if you will? We're going to have a look at the global level first. Well, at global level, let me tell you what I'll do. I'll go through different layers. At global level, the first main trend, which sounds very obvious, is that we see there's an increase for mobility needs in the world. That's due to population growth, but also an increase in purchasing power, plus also the way our societies and industries are organized. Our economies are more distributed, and it's also based on the performance of transportation modes, which means that we tend to look for the best return on transportation modes. The OECD says that all regions included, even though there are trends that are bigger in China, India, Southeast Asia and Africa, that the trend is valid everywhere. Now, the second main trend, that's the next layer, is the different forms of e-mobility. And that is, we see more and more people who have their individual vehicles, all regions included. If we look at passenger cars, well, we can talk about peaks or plateaus in terms of car units sold on some mature markets, but by and large, all regions included, what we're looking at is more passenger cars. And in Brazil, well, there's more like a catch-up. They have increased their numbers twofold in the recent past to reach more or less half of what we have in Europe. But China as well. China today is what Brazil was 10 years ago, and they increased their number of passenger cars by 25 in 5 years. So you see how quickly people want to have their own passenger cars. But this doesn't necessarily mean passenger cars everywhere. It's individual mobility. That is, in some cases, these are novel ways of being able to be transported with wheelers as well that we've seen in the US, or lighter vehicles with 2 or 3 wheelers with engines in many regions in the world. Okay, I have another question about developing countries, for instance, Africa, Asia and India. What about these countries? What are the market trends or market dynamics? I think you talked about those earlier on. Correct. Well, in addition to the 2 main trends I mentioned before, what you'll have to remember is that there's more and more diversification. Diversification of vehicles, because sources of energy are different, are diversified, and also the size of vehicles varies. Plus, the different features and connectivity on board, plus services. Services are more diversified. Services on board, like mobility services. And everywhere in the world, the intermediary modes. By that I mean what's not individual transportation modes and what's not also public transport. Well, these intermediary modes are developing now. We can talk about this later on if you want to, but this under the influence of digital technology. We've seen a sharp increase in these intermediary modes of transportation in emerging countries, in Africa and Asia, in India as well. These intermediary modes correspond to something like 40% of modal mobility, that is people's daily mobility, and this in towns that have either public transport or not at all. And sometimes it's an informal way, for instance, collective taxis or minibuses that are taxis. Now, or on more formal and organized markets, what we're looking at is modes that are changing. These modes of transportation are being consolidated in such a way that in some cases, individual motorization would stabilize at levels that are lower than the ones we've seen in the US, in Europe, and the very industrialized countries. Good. Could we talk about France now in Europe? Certainly. In France and in Europe, these intermediary modes are developing in different ways. For instance, what we're looking at is the French VTC, or car sharing, that is. And if we look at the most recent data that we have for the Greater Paris region, the Enquête Globale Transport from 2018, what we're seeing in this document is that we have 1% of daily commuting in 2018 in Greater Paris is with VTC, also with other modes of transportation. And in 2018, also, we've seen that the trend is growing faster. These intermediary modes are growing and gaining market share. We could look at another town like Moscow, for instance. Well, if this is in Europe, in Moscow, which is more or less as big as the Greater Paris, we have more than 1 million daily transportations that are made with taxis and car sharing. And also we have close cousins in North America, and I'm very much interested in Vancouver. Now, this is a town which is smaller in size, several hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, but there's more than 1/3 of the population in Vancouver that have a car-sharing system. And the potential in this case is that the daily mobility might be totally reshuffled, which is what we're tracking and monitoring. And of course, there's more pressure in the downtown centres. This is what we see daily. Okay, so that means that depending on where you are, that is in the countryside or in towns, in Vancouver, in Paris, well, we have needs. And these needs are quite different. And what we're looking at, the challenges we're looking at is quite different. So you adapt to the needs, correct. And it's always very important to make a difference, even though it's a bit quick. That is saying either the countryside or downtown, because there are inequalities between our regions in France. And the question is very important if you look at all the services that are being developed today, for instance, sustainable mobility services. It's very important to know if these services also come with solutions for these rural areas. We think we'll have to organize all that, but these are things we're studying very carefully. And the car mobility weighs on rural households and even more so on urban households. We have to invent solutions, and the solutions will have to be developed soon if we don't want to have more and more pressure. Okay, I get that. And that's what you're working on daily. Now, could we perhaps try and better understand these trends? Our habits are changing, the way we live is different, and at present, during COVID, there are many changes as well. So what are the driving forces for these evolutions or developments? Well, these engines are quite complex. I'll start with a simple example. If we can do things simple, we'll do things simple. Now, mobility systems today suffer from the fact that we rely on oil. Sorry for being that blunt, but I'll tell you what this means. The International Energy Agency says that 92% of the energy used by transportation systems in the world are based on oil. And then there's 3% of biofuels, 1% of electricity. There's also natural gas. So there's a long way. And that's why we're here. Correct. In a country such as France, we have electric vehicles, we have electric trains, we have biofuels managed by Europe. We think that maybe we're more advanced, but in France, we are still at 90% of energy that's coming from oil, 8% from biofuels and 2% from electricity. Now, this is how we rely on oil, and this is also connected to another economic idea that's very important, is that the energy bill is really high and volatile, and that means more precariousness for households and for the importing countries. That leads to geopolitical pressure, and what's at stake as well is emissions. Local pollutants are issued with the WHO says that 1% of the people who die in the world in a premature way is due to that, and also global greenhouse gases. And that's why I usually like starting with that. It's a simple idea, and this is also very much connected to tensions that we're trying to overcome. There are also tensions connected to congestion and lack of safety on the road. So all of these factors are such that we need to consider a transition towards mobility systems that we hope will be more sustainable. Now, this being said, digital is something very important in the equation in this transition. So if we can say a few words about digital, the IT and IS technologies change the transportation systems. It's been the case for decades. Thanks to them, we have more modern public transport, we have a better management of traffic. Could you give us some examples? Yes, synchronization of traffic lights, information for passengers on public transport, on displays. Yeah, we've had them for decades. What's more recent and what really has an impact on what's happening today in the mobility systems in towns is smartphones. And the first 3G iPhone started in 2008, a bit more than 10 years. We wonder how we were living before that. Yeah, it's very practical and it's pervasive and has changed so many things in mobility. For instance, in the service offerings that existed before, in what we do, about the time we have on public transport, and it all started in 2008. That's when we've seen a mushrooming of offerings with more functionalities, the fact that we can use geolocation and be informed in real time. So much so that we've seen a quick development of digital apps for shared mobility. We have an observatory that we set up that has found 230 of them present in 800 major towns. And this really is a revolution. You might say that this very much looks like the Uber business plan, but no, they are all specific, adapt to the local context, they're very inventive, and that's part of the evolutions and developments we're keeping an eye on and based on digital. And things keep on changing. Correct. And they change on the basis of our needs because people behave differently, they live differently. Technologies are used for all. That's true. And we consume differently, we live differently, and there are products that are replacement products. This is what we're seeing at present due to the COVID crisis, which is tough. That is, we replace physical mobility with virtual mobility, but it's much more than this. We replace also I replace my mobility with a parcel delivery person who will provide me with what I need, where I need that object. And this is something we keep an eye on as well, because this will not necessarily improve the performance in the mobility system, but then we can harness them towards sustainable mobility systems. Right, okay, could you say perhaps something about electric mobility that you brushed upon? Can you tell us more about electric vehicles? And the market's developing fast. That's true. Well, again, there are many differences. The International Energy Agency has said that if we look at a total of 7 million electric vehicles in 2019, there's 50% of those that were in China, which really means that this country is developing fast, 25% in Europe and 20% in the United States. So apart from these three main markets, the rest is more anecdotal. And we're considering some of these markets, for instance, China, which is interesting in many ways. If you look at the volumes of units sold, the new units, but also because electric mobility in China is all segments included. Several hundreds of millions of two-wheelers, electric two-wheelers sold, and also all the bus fleets operated in some towns in China are now transitioning. It's an interesting market, but also we consider other markets like markets in Europe. Norway in 2019 has seen a percentage of electric vehicles going up to 46% in new passenger cars. So this is a market which is shifting, which is turning around. Correct. And perhaps a few words about the health crisis. This is good for people realizing that electricity is something very important, or e-mobility. Well, yeah, it seems that the polls say that a part of the population establishes a link between environmental objectives and the COVID crisis, the health crisis. Let's hope that this will last and that it'll contribute to a change in behaviors. We know that there's always inertia and it's always a complex thing. We like working on infrastructure and vehicles, but when it comes to behaviors, governance, planning, regulation, that's always a bit more difficult. Okay, can we talk about your book in a nutshell? You have a book entitled Urban Mobility and the Smartphone. We've just alluded to that book, and smartphones, as you said, have had major impacts on our driving habits. Can you tell us more about what we have in your book? Certainly. Now, with Ana Aguilera, we thought, and that was a challenge, we thought, how has this smartphone changed urban mobility in the world? So we've looked at how people use their smartphones, how people move around, what they do when they're on the move. And also we looked at another angle, the angle of services, as I told you before. We looked at the global level, but also we looked at specific cases. That is how companies in Indonesia would become the first company that propose or come up with mobility services on a scooter, but also hair care at home, and masseurs at home, etc. We also look at public policies or policy making, and that's something very important since we need to support these changes, and that means that innovations and new behaviors should be based on public policies or policy making as well, so that we could frame all that. We don't want anybody to drift away, and also to accompany the best trends according to us, things that go along the lines of sustainable mobility. And together with other researchers and colleagues, we looked at mobility data and how we could use mobility data and reuse mobility data. This is an extremely important question. The title of your book is Urban Mobility and the Smartphone. Now that we've looked at the outlook, what about the impacts of all of that in the future, in the midterm, probably? Let's say in 5, 10, 15 years from now? Well, to me, it means that we'll have to continue and train people to mobility and mobility challenges. That's true for the engineers, that's going to be true for the researchers, that's going to be true as well for policymaking, because tomorrow's urban mobility systems need to be smart. By that, I mean data management that I mentioned before, but also it means communication between different types of mobility modes. Mobility as a service could be a grail, that is an integration between different mobility solutions in a given region or territory. But what's really at stake is human beings, how human beings are going to use these systems. They themselves will be mobile, or they will be regulators. There'll be service regulators, there'll be manufacturers and developers, and we need to invest in these skills, these human skills. We shouldn't underestimate this aspect, because we're going to have even more diversity. We can't say we're going to have a one-size-fits-all for all the systems, and everywhere at every single minute we'll have to pull together the best solutions to meet the local challenges and to make the most of local inventiveness, etc. And this is, to me, the big challenge tomorrow, to do things in a diverse way, but with a method to be followed. Well, thank you very much, Virginie, for sharing that with us. It's so interesting. All the best to you in research, and I'd like to thank you all. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for listening. We'll be again with you later on at 5:30 with Carlo Ratti. Thank you.